you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, Permit Application Forms webinar series. This webinar is the first of two webinars developed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Water Permits Division to provide outreach to NPDES permit applicants for completion and submission of their NPDES permit application forms. In today's webinar, we'll cover the regulatory requirements for NPDES permit application, walk through the permit application process, and review EPA's updated NPDES permit application forms, which were published in June 2019. Before we get started, I'll make some introductions and address one housekeeping item. So your speakers for this presentation are myself, Susanna Baines, Dave Hare, and Audrey Signorelli. Dave and I are with the Water Permits Division of the US EPA in Washington, D.C. Audrey is with PG Environmental, an EPA contractor. With regards to that housekeeping item, I want to let everyone know that the materials used in this presentation have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the EPA. NPDES permitting is governed by the existing requirements of the Clean Water Act and EPA's NPDES implementing regulations. These statutory and regulatory provisions contain legally binding requirements. The information in this presentation is not binding. Furthermore, it supplements and does not modify existing EPA policy, guidance, and training on NPDES permitting. The EPA may change the contents of this presentation in the future. So moving on next to background, I'm going to pass it over to Dave.
Hi, this is Dave Hare with EPA's Office of Water. And we'll start today with a little background on EPA's regulations regarding NPDES permit applications. EPA's NPDES permit application requirements are found in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR for short, at Section 122.21. These regulations establish the specific information that must be provided by specific categories of applicants. And EPA developed 8 permit application forms corresponding to the regulatory requirements in 40 CFR 122.21. The previous versions of the 8 application forms for individual NPDES permits were developed by EPA as the program evolved, and several had not been revised for over 30 years. Please note that the forms that we're discussing today are to be used for applicants seeking coverage under an individual NPDES permit. Applicants seeking coverage under NPDES general permit typically submit a notice of intent, or NOI, that is specific to each general permit. We will not be covering the general permit application process or notice of intent requirements in this presentation. The 8 NPDES permit application forms developed by EPA are listed in the first column on this slide. The third column provides the regulatory citation where you can find the corresponding application requirements. As you can see, each permit application form corresponds to a different category of discharger subject to permitting. For example, if you're a new or existing publicly owned treatment works, or POTW, you will need to submit application form 2A. If you are an existing manufacturing facility that discharges processed wastewater, you'll need to submit application form 2C. In February 2019, EPA published the NPDES Application and Program Updates Rule. This rule became effective just a few months ago in June 2019. The purpose of the rule was to modernize the NPDES regulations, promote submission of complete permit applications, and clarify certain regulatory requirements to allow more timely development of NPDES permits that protect human health and the environment. The rulemaking included regulatory changes to improve and clarify the regulations in the following categories: regulatory definitions, permit applications, and the public notice process. Today, we'll be focusing on the regulatory changes pertaining to the permit applications. The rule included several updates to permit application requirements at 40 CFR 122.21, as listed on this slide. These revisions include updates to EPA's contact information explaining where applicants can obtain the application forms, requirements to provide North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes, in addition to Standard Industrial Classification, or SIC codes, that applies to all applicants except for POTWs and treatment works treating domestic sewage. Requirements for new POTWs to provide effluent data within 24 months after commencement of their discharge, and allowance for non-POTW dischargers to provide data from the past 4.5 years to satisfy effluent data requirements, addition of email address to previously required contact information, requirements for POTWs to report numbers of significant industrial users, or SIUs, and non-significant categorical industrial users, or NSCIUs, and requirements for applicants to indicate whether they have a cooling water intake structure or if they are requesting a variance. As we walk through each of the forms later in this presentation, we'll point out where these changes were made in each of the forms. To support the changes to the application regulations in 40 CFR 122.21, EPA made conforming revisions to each of the 8 NPDES application forms. In addition to the regulatory changes, EPA took this opportunity to revise the structure and content of all 8 application forms to provide a consistent style and format. EPA also expanded and enhanced the instructions for each of the forms to ensure that they more closely align with the underlying federal regulations. The updated forms and instructions are now available in Adobe Portable Document Format, or PDF, on EPA's website at the address listed on this slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Audrey.
All right. Now that we know a little of the background, it's time to talk about the application process. The first question you may have is, do I need to submit an NPDES permit application? Well, 40 CFR section 122.21a tells us that anyone discharging or proposing to discharge pollutants to waters of the United States who does not have an effective permit must apply for an NPDES permit, except for some very specific exclusions which are listed in 40 CFR section 122.3. For an existing permittee wishing to continue an activity after the expiration date of their permit, the standard conditions at 40 CFR section 122.41b specify that the permittee must apply for and obtain a new permit. When a facility is owned and operated by the same facility, it's fairly clear that that entity must apply for the permit. When a facility is owned by one person but operated by another person, for example, one company hires another company to build and operate a treatment facility, who is under obligation to apply for a permit? 40 CFR section 122.21b tells us that in such cases, the operator is responsible for applying for the permit. The next question you may have is, when should I submit my application? The timing for submittal of an application depends on whether the discharge is new, existing, or for stormwater from construction activity. For a new facility that has not previously sought coverage under an NPDES permit for a discharge, the application deadline is 180 days before the planned date of discharge commencement. Facilities applying for a permit renewal for an existing discharge are required to submit an application at least 180 days before the expiration of the existing permit. Facilities applying for a permit to discharge stormwater from construction activity are required to submit an application at least 90 days before the planned date of construction commencement. Note that authorized states can have more stringent deadlines than the deadlines specified in the federal regulations. All right, you've decided you need to apply for a permit, and you know when you must submit the application. You may now be wondering which forms you should complete. This will depend on several factors, including where your discharge is located. If the discharge is located in a jurisdiction in which an EPA regional office is the permitting authority, you are required to use the approved EPA application forms. If the discharge is located in a jurisdiction in which a state, territory, or tribe is the permitting authority, they may require use of EPA's application forms, or they may have developed their own state-specific application forms. States may also require submission of additional forms that supplement the EPA forms. Where a state uses their own forms, the forms must still meet the minimum application requirements specified in 40 CFR Section 122.21. The final NPDES application and program updates rule provides states with up to 1 year to make conforming programmatic and regulatory changes, and up to 2 years if statutory changes are needed. So how do you know if a state or EPA region is your permitting authority? This map shows the states that currently have NPDES program status. As you can see, we currently have 47 states and 1 territory, the U.S. Virgin Islands, that have authorization to implement the NPDES permit program. If you're located in one of these jurisdictions, you should contact the state or territory to determine the appropriate application form or forms to submit. In Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Mexico, and all territories except the Virgin Islands, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, the EPA region is the permitting authority. If you're located in one of these jurisdictions, you should use the approved EPA application form. As mentioned earlier, each form corresponds to a different category of dischargers. You should select a form that represents the type of discharge to be covered by the permit for which you are applying. We'll talk about the applicability of each of the forms in detail later in the presentation. Note that the federal regulations also include application requirements for discharges from municipal separate storm sewer systems, or MS4s. Although there are no specific application forms for MS4s, there are, in fact, extensive application requirements in 40 CFR Section 122.26D. Similarly, there are application requirements for cooling water intake structures, but no associated application form. Once you have completed the appropriate application forms, you must submit your application package. If you're located in a jurisdiction in which an EPA regional office is the permitting authority, submit your application package to the EPA region. If you're located in a jurisdiction in which a state or territory is the permitting authority, submit your application package to the state or territory. This slide lists contact information, including mailing addresses for each of the EPA regional offices. This contact information can also be found in EPA Forms 1, 2A, and 2S. You've submitted your application. Now what? After receiving an application for an individual permit, the permitting authority will review the application for completeness and accuracy. The permitting authority may contact you to verify information or request additional information necessary to develop the NPDES permit. If the permitting authority determines that the application is complete, they will use the application information to develop the draft NPDES permit and either a fact sheet or statement of basis that explains the rationale behind the draft permit provisions. If after submitting your application, you become aware that you have failed to submit relevant information or that you submitted incorrect information in the application, 40 CFR Section 122.41 L8 requires that you promptly submit such facts or information. Now let's turn our attention to the actual forms. Each application form document consists of 3 main components: a cover page, instructions, and the application form itself. Let's have a look at these, starting with the cover page. Here's the cover page for application form 1. The first thing to notice is the form number and title located at the beginning of the page beneath the header. Be sure to select the form that corresponds to your type of discharge. The next thing you'll notice is the form header. Among other things, the header indicates the date of the last revision. Use this information to ensure you're using the most recent version of the form. At the bottom of each cover page, you'll find a note describing the applicability of the forms and whether the form should be submitted in conjunction with any other forms. Lastly, each cover page includes 2 print buttons in the top right-hand corner. Selecting the Print All Pages button will print all pages of the document, including the instructions and form. Selecting the Print Form Only button will print only the form. When submitting your application package, you need only to submit the form itself without the cover page or instructions. Now let's look at the form instructions. The forms include 3 types of instructions: general instructions, line-by-line instructions, and general instructions for reporting, sampling, and analysis. Applicants are strongly encouraged to review all instructions prior to completing the application form. The general instructions are intended to provide applicants with the who, where, when, and what of the application completion and submission process. The general instructions for Form 2A are shown on this slide. As you can see, these general instructions contain information on who must complete the form, where to file the completed form, when to file the completed form, fees, public availability of submitted information, completion of forms, and definitions. The general instructions will vary somewhat on each of the forms. Following the general instructions, each form will include line-by-line or itemized instructions. The line-by-line instructions provide detailed information to instruct applicants how to respond to each item on the form. The first page of the line-by-line instructions for Form 2A is shown on this slide. As an example, let's look at the line-by-line instructions for Item 1.1. These instructions correspond to Item 1.1 of the form. The line-by-line instructions specify that when providing the response for the facility name, the applicant should enter the facility's official or legal name and should not use a colloquial name. The instructions also specify that when providing the contact information, the applicant should select an individual who is thoroughly familiar with the operation of the facility and with the facts reported in the application. The third type of instructions is the general instructions for reporting, sampling, and analysis. These instructions are included in forms requiring the sampling and reporting of effluent data and vary in each form. The general instructions for reporting, sampling, and analysis for Form 2A are shown on this slide. These instructions include an important note reminding applicants to review the instructions before completing the data tables, general items, which instruct the applicants to complete a table for each outfall and allow reporting of data in separate attachments, a note for new dischargers, and instructions for reporting of effluent data. The instructions for reporting of effluent data specify where samples should be collected, data age requirements, analytical method requirements, and the units of measurement that should be used. Once you've reviewed the instructions, you're ready to fill out and complete the application form. EPA develops the NPDES permit application forms in fillable portable document format, or PDF, to facilitate easier and more efficient completion of forms. The fillable PDF forms allow applicants to enter responses directly within the form. The first page of Form 2A is shown on this slide. The first page of each application form identifies the applicable form number and title. The header includes space for the applicant to provide the EPA identification number, NPDES permit number, and facility name, which is repeated on each subsequent page of the form. If using the fillable PDF form, this information will auto-populate on subsequent pages once the information is entered on the first page. Each form is divided into major sections that correspond to the federal regulatory requirements. The section headers appear as rows with a black background and white text. The section headers denote the section number, type of information requested in the section, and the corresponding regulatory citation. Subsequent titles appear horizontally on the left-hand side of the form. Each item is assigned a corresponding item number. As we saw a few slides ago, the line-by-line instructions include instructions for completing each item. The form requests responses to be provided either by writing or typing information into text boxes or selecting checkboxes. Some forms require the applicant to provide analytical testing results in tables located at the end of the form. Applicants must complete the applicable tables for each outfall at their facility. Note the outfall number in the space provided at the top of each page. Note that all required quantitative data reported in application must be collected according to sufficiently sensitive analytical methods, as required by 40 CFR Section 122.21E3. EPA and state permitting authorities use data from the permit application to determine whether pollutants are present in an applicant's discharge and to quantify the levels of all detected pollutants. These pollutant data are then used to determine whether technology or water quality-based effluent limits are needed in the facility's NPDES permit. It is critical, therefore, that applicants provide data that have been measured at levels that will be meaningful to the decision-making process. As a reminder, applicants should review the line-by-line instructions and general instructions for reporting, sampling, and analysis prior to completing the tables. Once the applicant has completed all other portions of the application, the applicant should complete the checklist and certification statement section located at the end of the form. The checklist is included to ensure that the applicant has completed and is submitting all of the required information, including any attachments. The certification statement certifies the information submitted in the application is true, accurate, and complete. Note that the Clean Water Act establishes strict penalties for knowingly providing false information in an NPDES application. Who is the appropriate person to sign on the dotted line of the permit application? For a corporation, the appropriate signatory is a president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, responsible corporate officer, or a manager of one or more facilities who is authorized to sign. For a partnership or sole proprietorship, a general partner or the proprietor must sign the form. For a municipality, state, federal, or other public agency, a principal executive officer or ranking elected official must sign. Now we'll walk through each of the individual application forms in more detail. For each form, we'll discuss the types of dischargers that must complete the form, whether any other forms are required in conjunction with the form, major information requirements, and updates to the form resulting from the NPDES application and program updates rule. All right, so we'll start with Form 1. So Form 1 must be completed by all NPDES permit applicants except POTWs and treatment works treating domestic sewage. If you operate a concentrated animal feeding operation or concentrated aquatic animal production facility, manufacturing, commercial, mining, or silvicultural operation, or other industrial facility, you must submit Form 1. Form 1 must be submitted in conjunction with Forms 2B, 2C, 2D, 2E, and 2F. So Form 1 collects general information about the facility. The types of information required are listed on the slide, which include the facility name, address, location, including a topographic map, contact information, and a description of the business. EPA's updated Form 1 reflects 4 changes to conform to the NPDES application and program updates rule. EPA has added a requirement to include email address to applicant and facility operator contact information. The form now requires applicants to report up to 4 North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes, in addition to the standard industrial classification, or SIC codes, that describe activities conducted at the facility. The form includes a new requirement to indicate whether the applicant uses cooling water, and if yes, the source of the cooling water. If the facility uses a cooling water intake structure as described in 40 CFR Part 125, subparts I and J, the facility may have additional application requirements under 40 CFR Section 122.21R. Note that the information required by 40 CFR Section 122.21R is not requested as part of Form 1. Applicants should contact the NPDES permitting authority to determine the specifics of what to provide and when. The form also includes a requirement to indicate if the applicant plans to apply for a Clean Water Act technology variance, if known at the time of application. Note that applicants are not being asked to submit any other information at the time of the Form 1 submission. Applicants should contact the NPDES permitting authority to determine the specifics of what to provide and when. The ability to request a variance is not limited to the time of application, and an applicant may request a variance consistent with statutory and regulatory requirements. As mentioned earlier, the updated form now also includes a completeness checklist to help ensure that all of the required sections have been completed and to let the applicant know which sections have attachments containing supplemental material. Form 2A must be completed by new and existing publicly owned treatment works, or POTWs. A publicly owned treatment works is defined in 40 CFR Section 403.3 as a treatment works owned by a state or municipality, including any devices and systems used in the storage, treatment, recycling, and reclamation of municipal sewage or industrial waste of a liquid nature. Because Form 2A includes similar basic information requirements as Form 1, applicants submitting Form 2A are not required to submit Form 1. The first section of Form 2A requires basic information regarding the facility and applicant, the collection system and population served, types of discharge points, and outfalls. This section must be completed by all POTWs. The remainder of Form 2A is divided into several sections. The determination of which sections a given facility must complete is based on the design flow rate of that facility and the characteristics of the discharge. Section 2 requires applicants with a design flow of 0.1 million gallons per day or more to submit estimates of inflow and infiltration, provide a topographic map and a process flow diagram, give contact information for any contractor performing operation and maintenance of the facility, and provide information on scheduled improvements. Section 3 requires descriptions of the outfalls, receiving water, and effluent treatment. It also requires completion of one or more data tables, which we'll discuss on the next few slides. Section 4 applies to POTWs with significant industrial users. This section requires applicants to indicate the number of significant industrial users and non-significant categorical industrial users that discharge to the POTW and provide information on the POTW's pretreatment program. Applicants completing this section must also provide information on significant industrial users in Table F, located at the end of the form. Note that this information need not be completed for non-significant categorical industrial users. Finally, Section 5 applies to POTWs with a combined sewer system. A combined sewer system is a wastewater collection system owned by a state or municipality which conveys sanitary wastewaters and stormwater through a single pipe system to a POTW treatment plant. Form 2A requires applicants to complete one or more data tables summarizing effluent testing results. The items in Section 3 are designed to guide the applicant through the process of determining which tables they should complete. At a minimum, effluent testing data must be based on at least 3 samples taken within 4.5 years prior to the date of the application. Applicants for a new discharge must provide all information available at the time of the application and are required to submit actual data no later than 24 months after the facility commences discharge. Applicants are strongly encouraged to review the instructions for additional details prior to completing the tables. Let's take a quick look at each of the Form 2A tables. Table A collects information on certain conventional and non-conventional pollutants. Table A must be completed by all POTWs. Table B collects information on additional conventional and non-conventional pollutants. Table B must be completed by facilities with a design flow greater than 0.1 million gallons per day. Table C requires effluent testing data for toxic pollutants, including metals, cyanide and total phenols, volatile organic compounds, acid extractable compounds, and base neutral compounds. Table C must be completed by facilities with a design flow greater than 1 million gallons per day, or that are required to have a pretreatment program. Table D provides space to report any additional effluent testing data required by the NPDES permitting authority. Lastly, Table E must be completed by facilities with a design flow greater than 1 million gallons per day, or that are required to have a pretreatment program. This table requires effluent testing data for whole effluent toxicity. EPA's updated Form 2A reflects 4 changes to conform to the NPDES Application and Program Updates rule. EPA has added a requirement to include email address to applicant, biosolids transporters and receivers, and contractors' contact information. The form includes a requirement to indicate if the applicant plans to apply for a Clean Water Act technology variance, if known at the time of the application. Note that applicants are not being asked to submit any other information at the time of the Form 2A submission. Applicants should contact their permitting authority to determine the specifics of what to provide and when. The ability to request a variance is not limited to the time of the application, and an applicant may request a variance consistent with statutory and regulatory requirements. The form now requires new POTW applicants to provide initial sampling data within 24 months of commencement of the discharge. It also requires applicants to report the number of significant industrial users and non-significant categorical industrial users discharging to the POTW. The updated form now also includes a completion checklist.
Form 2B must be completed by concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and concentrated aquatic animal production, or CAP facilities. Applicants submitting Form 2B must also complete and submit Form 1. The first section of Form 2B includes 2 questions to distinguish whether the applicant is a CAFO or CAP facility and if they are an existing or proposed facility. CAFOs must complete sections 2 through 6, which require contact information for the owner or operator, location information, a topographic map, CAFO characteristics for existing facilities, and the applicant's nutrient management plan. CAP facilities must provide information on characteristics of the facility, such as the types of containment structures, species of fish grown, and amount of feed given. The NPDES Application and Program Updates rule did not require any updates to Form 2B. Similar to the other forms, the updated form does now include a completeness checklist. Form 2C must be completed by existing manufacturing, commercial, mining, and silvicultural operations. This is a permit renewal application for most industrial facilities. Applicants submitting Form 2C must also complete and submit Form 1. Form 2C consists of several sections, which include the outfall location. This section collects information on the location and receiving water for each outfall. A line drawing and information on flows and treatment. This section asks what contributes wastewater to each outfall. What are the flows contributed by those processes or other operations, and what treatment do those flows receive? Production information. This section requests information on the quantity of production or raw materials, and this is needed for effluent guideline implementation. Improvements. This section requires a description of required construction or upgrading of treatment equipment that could affect the discharges. Effluent and intake characteristics. We'll take a closer look at this one on the next few slides. Used or manufactured toxics. This section requires applicants to list toxic pollutants that are used or manufactured as an intermediate or final product or byproduct. Biological toxicity tests. This section requires applicants to describe any whole effluent toxicity testing conducted within the past 3 years. Contract analysis information. This section requires contact information for any pollutants analyzed by a contract laboratory. Lastly, applicants must submit any additional information required by the permitting authority. Like Form 2A, Form 2C requires applicants to complete one or more data tables summarizing effluent and intake testing information. The items in Section 7 are designed to guide the applicant through the process of determining which tables they should complete. When completing the tables, existing data conducted within the last 4.5 years may be used, if available, in lieu of sampling conducted solely for the purposes of the application. Once again, applicants are strongly encouraged to review the instructions for additional details prior to completing the tables. Table A collects information on conventional and non-conventional pollutants. Table A must be completed by all applicants for all outfalls unless a waiver is obtained from the permitting authority. Table B collects information on toxic metals, cyanide, total phenols, and organic toxic pollutants. The requirements for Table B depend on whether the facility is considered a primary industry or not. A list of primary industry categories can be found in 40 CFR Part 122, Appendix A, and in Form 2C, Exhibit 2C3. If the facility falls into a primary industry category, the applicant must mark testing required and provide effluent testing data for toxic metals, cyanide, and total phenols in Table B, Section 1. The applicant must also review Exhibit 2C3 to determine whether testing is required for pollutants in any of the 4 gas chromatography mass spectrometry, or GCMS, fractions. For each required fraction, the applicant must mark testing required and provide effluent testing data for each pollutant within that fraction in Table B, Sections 2 through 5. For example, an applicant applying to discharge from an electroplating facility must supply data for volatile, acid, and base-neutral organic pollutants, but would not be required to provide data for pesticides. For any non-required GCMS fractions, the applicant must check believed present or believed absent to indicate whether there is reason to believe that any of the pollutants listed are discharged. For any pollutants marked believed present, the applicant must provide effluent testing data. Recall from the example on the previous slide that a facility in the electroplating primary industry category is not required to mark testing required for the pesticide fraction. They would still need to mark believed present or believed absent for all pollutants in the pesticide fraction and provide effluent testing data for any pollutants that are believed present. For a facility that is not in a primary industry category, the applicant must check believed present or believed absent for all pollutants in Sections 1 through 5 of Table B and provide effluent testing data for any pollutants that are believed present. Table C collects information on additional conventional and non-conventional pollutants. To complete Table C, applicants must check believed present or believed absent. Applicants subject to effluent limitation guidelines that limit pollutants directly or indirectly, and applicants who believe pollutants may be present in their facility's discharge must provide effluent testing data for those pollutants. Table D collects information on certain hazardous substances and asbestos. To complete Table D, applicants must check believed present or believed absent. For every pollutant believed present, the applicant must describe the reasons the pollutant is expected to be discharged. Applicants are not required to perform analytical tests for any of the Table D pollutants, but should report any prior test results available. Lastly, Table E collects information on 2378 TCDD. To complete Table E, applicants must indicate whether TCDD congeners are used or manufactured at the facility, or if 2378 TCDD is or may be present in the discharge. If so, the applicant must provide qualitative data for TCDD. EPA's updated Form 2C reflects one change to conform to the NPDES application and program updates rule. The form instructions now state that effluent data from the previous 4.5 years may be used to meet testing requirements if available, provided that all data requirements are met, all data are representative of the discharge, and all representative data are considered in the values reported. A completeness checklist is also now included at the end of the form.
We've just discussed the renewal application for existing industrial facilities. Now we'll talk about the application for new facilities. Form 2D must be completed by new manufacturing, commercial, mining, and silvicultural operations that have not yet commenced discharge of processed wastewater. Applicants submitting Form 2D must also complete and submit Form 1. The Form 2D application requirements resemble those in Form 2C, except that it requests information on the expected facility and discharge conditions since the facility has not yet commenced discharge. An engineering report is also required, which the NPDES permit writer will use to determine appropriate treatment methods and associated permit conditions and limits. Form 2D requires applicants to complete one or more data tables summarizing effluent and intake information. The items in Section 7 are designed to guide the applicant through the process of determining which tables they should complete. Section 7 requires applicants to report estimated data for the parameters and pollutants listed in tables A through E. Applicants are not required to conduct actual sampling and analysis at the time of application. If, however, data from such analyses are available, applicants must report those data. Note that no later than 24 months after discharges commence, the applicant must complete and submit quantitative data for the pollutants and parameters in tables A through E. However, applicants need not report results for tests they have already performed and reported under the discharge monitoring requirements of their NPDES permit. Remember to review the instructions for additional details prior to completing the tables. EPA's updated Form 2D reflects one change to conform to the NPDES application and program updates rule. The form instructions now clarify that effluent data must be submitted within 24 months of commencement of discharge, which was changed from 2 years. Form 2E must be completed by manufacturing, commercial, mining, and silvicultural operations which discharge only non-processed wastewater. Non-processed wastewater from industrial and commercial facilities includes, but is not limited to, sanitary waste, restaurant or cafeteria waste, and non-contact cooling water. Applicants submitting Form 2E must also complete and submit Form 1. Form 2E collects information on the outfall location, whether the facility is a new or existing discharger, waste types, and whether the facility uses cooling water additives, effluent characteristics for certain conventional and non-conventional pollutants, flow, treatment system, and it provides space for the applicant to provide any additional relevant information. The NPDES application and program updates rule did not require any updates to Form 2E. Form 2F must be used when applying for an individual permit for stormwater associated with industrial activity. Note, however, that these discharges are often covered under general permits that would require submission of a notice of intent, so we don't see many of these forms submitted. Applicants submitting Form 2F must also complete and submit Form 1. Additionally, if the discharge is composed of stormwater and non-stormwater, the applicant would also need to complete Form 2C, 2D, or 2E as appropriate. Form 2F requests information about outfall locations, scheduled improvements, pollutant sources, and the history of leaks and spills at the facility. It solicits narrative descriptions of pollutant sources, including the materials present at the site. As shown on the next slide, it requires applicants to sample discharges for conventional pollutants and other pollutants regulated in the NPDES permit held by the facility. The form also requests biological toxicity testing data. The NPDES application and program updates rule did not require any updates to Form 2F. Form 2F requires applicants to complete one or more data tables summarizing effluent information. The items in Section 7 are designed to guide the applicant through the process of determining which tables they should complete. Applicants for an existing discharge are required to report actual quantitative data. Existing data may be used, if available, in lieu of sampling conducted solely for the purposes of the application, provided it is representative of the present discharge and was collected within 3 years of the application due date. Applicants for a new source or discharge may supply estimated data along with the source of each estimate. No later than 24 months after the facility commences to discharge, the applicant must complete and submit sampling and analysis data for the pollutants and parameters in tables A through C. However, applicants need not report results for tests already performed and reported under the discharge monitoring requirements of their NPDES permit. As always, applicants should review the instructions for additional details prior to completing the tables. That brings us to our last form, Form 2S. Form 2S applies to new and existing treatment works treating domestic sewage. A treatment works treating domestic sewage is a POTW or any other sewage, sludge, or wastewater treatment devices or systems, regardless of ownership, including federal facilities, used in the storage, treatment, recycling, and reclamation of municipal or domestic sewage, including land dedicated for the disposal of sewage sludge. Because Form 2S includes similar basic information requirements, applicants submitting Form 2S are not required to submit Form 1. Form 2S is presented in a modular format, enabling information collection to be tailored to a facility's sewage sludge generation, treatment, use, or disposal practices. The form consists of 2 main sections, limited background information and permit application information, and a preliminary information section that directs the applicant to complete either of the 2 main sections. Part 1 applies to sludge-only facilities, which are facilities without a currently effective NPDES permit that have not been directed by the permitting authority to submit a full permit application. Part 2 must be completed by any facility that is submitting a full NPDES permit application. Part 1 requests a limited amount of information. It is intended to allow the permitting authority to identify these facilities, track sewage sludge use and disposal, and establish priorities for permitting. Part 2 is divided into 5 sections. Section 1 pertains to all applicants. The applicability of sections 2 through 5 depends on the facility's sewage sludge use or disposal practices. The exhibit on this slide, which is duplicated from Exhibit 2S2 of the Form 2S General Instructions, identifies the sections that are required to be completed for each activity. For example, if your facility generates sewage sludge or derives material from sewage sludge that is applied to the land in bulk form, you would need to complete Part 2, Sections 1, 2, and 3. EPA's updated Form 2S reflects one change to conform to the NPDES application and program updates rule. EPA has added requirements to include email address to all sections requiring contact information. And as with the other forms, the updated form includes completeness checklists for parts 1 and so just letting everyone know, our next webinar in this series is going to be November 13th, tips for submitting and completing an application and some answers to frequently asked questions. So go ahead and register for that if you haven't. Here's the link where you can find the registration page. And then just lastly, my contact information, if you would like to follow up with me about the webinar series or any other questions, my email and phone number are on the screen. So thank you everyone for attending.